to Christ the Center, your weekly conversation of Reformed theology. My name is Camden Busey, and I'm back here in Grayslake, Illinois, with another exciting topic today and an excellent guest. We're welcoming for the very first time to the program Dr. Todd Rester, who now is Associate Professor of Church History at Westminster Theological Seminary in Glenside, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Todd. It's great to speak with you.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, and I'm delighted to be here today to talk about some important subjects and matters. We're going to be introducing some significant things today, namely the person and the work of Petrus Van Mastricht. We have a new series. Well, it's a new old series, the Theoretical Practical Theology. We've got volumes 1 and 2 now available to us, published by Reformation Heritage Books. But these are new English translations of an old title, and we're right in the thick of it now, receiving good, solid English versions translated from the original Latin, and we have 2 volumes, and I guess we're expecting 7. So Todd is the translator. So Todd, thanks for doing this, and thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
Yeah.
It is a wonderful thing. The Dutch Reformed Translation Society has desired to do this translation for some time, and I'm really pleased to be a part of the team that they've put together, as it says on the book, of course.
Yeah.
You have myself translating, Dr. Beeke as editor, and then Michael Spangler, Pastor Michael Spangler, is helping us both as an assistant, as an editor, and as a translator. So it's been a good team. It's really come together well.
That's good to know, and thanks. It's helpful to know all the people involved in this, and sometimes it's just presumed or taken for granted that we just have books and they just show up, and we don't always realize all the effort and the many people that are involved in the production of a book, just even in general.
A translation like this is not a Lone Ranger affair. It has to have the work of a society behind it, and that's what you have with the Dutch Reformed Translation Society. And it also has to have a community that'll support it. The comparable project in the 19th century would have been the Calvin Translation Society, that's given us the commentaries and works there. So that same dynamic of translation society, translators, teams, publishers, as well as a community to put it together, it's a big project, and it takes quite a bit of folks to do it. So I've just been pleased with the project as well as with the process. So it's been good.
Oh, well, praise God for that. I'm delighted to hear that. I'd love to talk more about that, and we'll get into the work of Petrus Van Mastricht and why it's so significant and important that we now have these editions in English to make them more accessible to people who are not able to read in the original, such as myself. I don't have a good enough working knowledge of Latin to be able to work through this. Nevertheless, now we can be benefited by these works. But I think it would be helpful, just as a first-time guest and now a new professor at Westminster, for us to hear a little bit about your prior work. You've had an interesting path and done some really tremendous things just through your education. I'll just go back, and I'm looking at your list here and your teaching and professional history. But you did your PhD at Calvin, graduated in 2016. Am I correct in understanding that you were the last to be hooded by the venerable Dr. Muller? Is that true?
I was there at the 2016, and after that, I know that he was in the process of retirement. So I know that he was still working with some students who were finishing up. Now, whether or not I was the exact last one to be hooded, that's a great question. I wasn't present for the commencement at 2000 or the graduation exercises in 2017 or 18.
Yeah. Well, but, anyway, we'll just pretend you are and just give you that title.
Okay.
I appreciate that. It's actually more interesting if we don't know exactly. I think it adds to the mythology of it, perhaps.
Mythology.
Oh, no.
Right. Okay.
Whatever. I don't know. Maybe that's not the right word, but you get it. Makes for a better story.
Yes, right.
Sure. So what did you study at Calvin? Tell us a little bit about your history, and not only that you know Latin really well, but also you're church historian. How did all these things come about, and what have you been working on?
Well, back at RTS Jackson, where I did my MDiv, that's where I really came into contact with systematic theologians and historical theologians who were interested in both the content as well as the context. So that's where I would say some of the early introduction to the necessity of looking at context around how doctrines develop really came about. And as I started there, that's where I became interested in Muller's work, especially with the release of the Post-Reformation Reformed Dogmatics in its second edition. And I went to Grand Rapids at Calvin Theological Seminary. It started there actually in 2007. 2010, I did a doctoral fellowship at the University of Leiden, working on Franciscus Junius and the theology coming out of there through Marcius and de Moor. That those theologians at the University of Leiden set a trajectory for the way that Reformed Prolegomena functioned in the 17th century. And you can see how that sort of framework spread as students graduated from Leiden and went to other universities. A good example here would be Futsius, who ends up at the University of Utrecht. He was trained at Leiden. So you can see how, it's what people talk a lot of times about influence and continuity, and it's almost like it's a virus. It just floats in the air and lands on somebody. But what I was endeavoring to do in my dissertation was demonstrate how you can trace an intellectual chain of custody through a department of theology. So I went at Leiden and was looking at the way in which theology was taught from its beginnings until about 1780. And so that was the research in that doctoral fellowship at the University of Leiden. Came back to the States after that, and then finished the dissertation in 2016. The Maastricht project started in early 2009. So it's been a long time, but it's been a good process all the way around. Most recently, before Westminster, I was on a European Union Research Council project based out of Queen's University, Belfast, looking at religious war in the 16th to 18th century. My remit in that was examining early modern Franciscan Scotists on holy war, forced conversion, and some of these other issues that are percolating in some of their doctrines of just war.
Oh my!
So that was part of the project I was on for the last 3 years. Some of those translations will be coming out with Rutledge in a 2-volume set as part of that. Some of the
really?
output of that.
Oh,
yes,
interesting.
That's estimated. That'll probably come out in 2020. It'll be kind of we'll look at Protestant resistance theories on one side, and then on the other side we're looking at some of the Franciscan Scotists who had shall we say, a very vibrant doctrine of holy war.
Wow. I mean, that's tremendous. I'm looking forward to that. And what format will that be? I mean, you mentioned a translation, but
yes.
Do you have some historical theological analysis of the works that is going to attend to the original sources?
That was a 3-person project as far as the doctorates are concerned.
Okay.
We were also training a doctoral student in that process. And so there will be a variety of monographs that come out in subsequent years, but the translations will be out sooner than not.
Sure. Oh, that's great. That's great. So I'm going to ask some general questions just about translation, and the process herein before maybe we get into Maastricht's biography, just to briefly go over that in a minute, just to know who he was and what he was engaged with. But when you said you've started the Van Mastricht project back in 2009. Now, no doubt you've read a ton of his writing in Latin. What's your relationship? How would you describe your familiarity or your change in knowledge? I mean, you must feel like his style is kind of something like an old friend now. I mean, what is it like to be a translator and spend that much time translating one specific writer in a massive work like this?
One thing that you begin to recognize is patterns of diction, you begin to recognize, especially in a work this size. I mean, it's very important to realize that these systematic theologies like this, or in the handbooks from this period, they're not written by a professor going on sabbatical. That's not the way they're written. The way that they're written is by day in and day out, the cycle of exegesis, lecture, and disputation and conversation with students. That you could go to the British Library, for example, and other places in Europe, and you could find disputations from throughout his period at Utrecht over the whole life of his career, where these disputations would take a topic, a student would dispute on it, and there would be engagement around that. And out of the text of these disputations, which Maastricht is involved in editing and putting together, out of that comes this sort of constructed work. So when you say, yes, it's 7 volumes, what you're looking at is the product of a whole career.
Yeah, certainly.
And that's why it's so important, at least, if I can pull in a theme from my dissertation, it's so important to study these systematic theologies of this period in these handbooks as manuals of exegesis and manuals of doctrinal development in the context and life of an early modern university or school of theology.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot separate the theology that's being articulated from the community and the context in which it's developing. So it's an academic discipline, and that is part of the tone. In other pieces that Maastricht writes, it's a different sort of tone. You get a feel for that in his introductory letter in volume 1. The way that he writes, just as if he's speaking to you, but then when he gets into actually the academic side of it, he can be very pointed with his distinctions. It's in many ways humbling to see how firm of a grip he has on the varieties of literature in his own period. So getting to know him, it's also getting to know his sources. That's the other thing I would say, and that has been an exceedingly profitable experience. I'm not quite up with him on reading unpointed Hebrew.
Shame on you.
So I will readily admit that I am not reading the rabbinic commentators like Maastricht is. But it does push us. It does push us to see how thoroughly these early modern professors of Scripture really approached the text and approached its exposition. But for Maastricht, as I would say, many of the other professors at Utrecht, if not all of them, in this period were extremely focused on practice. They wanted to see the exegesis of the text result in doctrine. They wanted to defend it positively, but they also wanted to address error. And then finally, they wanted to provoke people towards a saving knowledge of Christ. You see that in the practical sections throughout. Practice for these gentlemen is not simply, hey, go do something. Frequently for Maastricht, the practice he has in view is this teaches us to take comfort in Christ. This teaches us to take comfort in God. This teaches us to repent. So what you see there is he's trying to bring into the Christian life various aspects. So you can see that his doctrinal sections are much more technical. His practical sections are much more pastoral. So it's been a privilege to go through all of that.
Well, that's helpful. I mean, that comes out even in the title, in the way that at least the theoretical, practical theology. When you dig into it and you start to explore his method and his deep concerns, you do see that he has maybe not a holistic approach. Maybe that's not the right word, but the theology definitely is meant to influence us and change us as people, that we would live in faithful obedience unto the Lord. So it's not pure theory that's just messing with our ideas. Neither is it pure practice that is uninformed by the truth or by what God has revealed. It's always and everywhere both.
You certainly could describe it as a holistic approach.
Yeah.
He would define saving faith, which is an interesting move for right after the Prolegomena, the next topic he takes up, and that's what's in the beginnings of volume 2 that we have. He certainly does take a holistic approach in the sense that he says that faith is an act of the whole soul. So that it's an act not only of the intellect and of the will, but it's also
emotions.
It engages the whole person. And in part, I think he gets there because he says also that's the nature of salvation too, is it engages the whole person, not just one aspect. So the theoretical, practical side of it is the method. You have to have the theory, but you also need to provoke theologians to practice, not only for themselves, but for their hearers. So that's where I think his utility is.
Yeah. Oh, it's tremendous, and I'm excited to talk about this today, and I hope our listeners are going to pick up copies of this and learn from Maastricht. But before we get ahead of ourselves, well, why don't we hear a little bit about his biography? We've learned about him. People who maybe have never heard about him before have ascertained now that he writes in Latin. He taught at Utrecht, and he's early modern. But why don't you help us out here and give us his dates and really kind of what was his context and really what's he known for?
1630 to 1706 is Maastricht's background. The biography in volume 1 is an excellent treatment.
It's really good and thorough. It's Adrian Neely, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, who wrote that? Yes,
it's very well done in the way that it's a consolidation of many different sources in multiple languages. So it's a fine piece of scholarship. And what we have here is in this biography is it'll take you through the early years of his education between 1630 and 52, from the time he was born. It's a little bit about his family, how they were originally from Maastricht in the Netherlands, but they were basically run out of that area in the period of the Spanish Furies, and they eventually settled elsewhere. And so what you have is Maastricht is raised in a pretty typical education of that period for someone of his station. He went through a Latin school, which was actually an ancient one in one sense. The school he went to for his, his junior high and high school years had been founded in 1280. So we talk about alumni here.
You think they have those sweaters, where it's like the EST 1280?
Yeah, right. Right. So to give you an example, whenever I say that he went to a classical liberal arts education,
yeah.
I think that gives you a sense of the area. But also from there, after he studied there, he goes on to study at Utrecht. One of his pastors was actually Johannes Hornbeek, who some of the listeners may know was a Dutch theologian who was emphatic on the nature of theology as a practical discipline. And also, Hornbeek wrote quite a few pieces dealing specifically with, missionary activity and engagement with other religions. So there's quite a bit in Hornbeek that's of interest. But he also met the Reformed theologian Hyspertus Fuchsius, who was the founding systematics professor at Utrecht and had a tremendously long career, very long-lived. Fuchsius was at the Synod of Dort and was still teaching all through the middle part of the 17th century. So after Maastricht's stint in school, he ended up as a pastor in a variety of churches in the German districts. And at the same time, he also was in a place called Xanten, which was under the Brandenburg court at the time. The significance of that is that he was in a mixed context. It wasn't just Reformed. It was Lutheran and it was Reformed. Folks were moving around in different congregations. Maastricht served as a pastor in some capacity for 25 years. And so by the time he was in his late 40s, headed towards his early 50s, he's had 25 years of pastoral experience.
Wow.
And then is also starting to see the rising tide of Cartesianism in the church. And that really bothers him. One of the issues that Maastricht sees as the deepest issue is what I would call methodological doubt. Maastricht is deeply concerned that if you start with doubt, there's a very real possibility you will never arrive at faith. In fact, he says you won't. That's not the way that doubt should be used. And so he writes some philosophical works that also have not been translated. It's this lovely book entitled The Gangrene of the Cartesian Novelty. It's a systematic theology that goes head by head, topic by topic, through all of the heads of theology, but uses that structure as a way to take apart Cartesianism.
Wow. Am I kind of right? This is quite the polemical writing, I think.
Yes.
I think the Van Tillians would approve of this.
If all we had of Maastricht was that work on the Gangrena, as it's called, it would be a significant piece of Reformed polemics. Mm-hmm. But that was not what he was that was not the consuming passion, I would say, of his ministry and of his education. He really was, he wanted to move pastors to a better preaching of the word for the sake of their congregants.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point of historical theology as well, because we have to understand that there are limitations with what we're working with. We can't sit next to Maastricht and, ask him questions. But let's say in another possible world that Gangrena was the only thing we had of him. You might have certain, ideas or assumptions about his character, personality, or whatever. But we should be thankful that we have so much of this work to see a fully, developed and well-rounded individual and everything that really entails.
I think that's an important point, that the biggest concern about the Cartesianism was much more concrete and much more practical. He could trace out, of course, the theory and the problems on a theoretical level with Cartesianism, and he certainly did. But I would say at the root of it, it's a pastoral concern about one, leading people down a dead end of methodological doubt in the way that you arrive at faith and the way that you know God. That, I think, even if you read the Gangrena, I think you would find places where that's where some of his deepest concerns are. And he's also deeply concerned, not just simply about this abstract philosopher somewhere.
Right.
What's exercising him the most is that there's folks that are appropriating these aspects of Descartes' method that are within the Reformed Church in this period. So it's a much more proximate concern.
Mm-hmm. And ecclesiastical too. I mean, it's within the context of the church. That's the reason for his concern.
Correct.
You mentioned Voetius? People who are not in the mix of all this, and I'm not well versed in this theology or historical theology myself. It's not my field. I'm interested, but it's not my expertise. But there's been some thoughts, or at least an understanding, that Maastricht was a follower of Voetius, or at least considered in that school of theology. But then I guess others have questioned that to see that some of his work or other people he's been involved with were Coxean, or something to that effect. I mean, how are we to understand Maastricht's relationship to Voetius and Voetius's theology?
Well, one thing I would say is that whenever he was engaged in his work in Cologne and Xanten and other places, there were Coxeans in his congregation. So he is a I would say a Voetian theologian. But when he's on the ground as a pastor, he still has to engage Coxeans. He still is trying to be some level of he's still trying to engage them in a pastoral sort of way that's constructive. He doesn't. So I think that's an important point. One of the things that brought him to some of his other universities before Utrecht, where he served as a professor, was the administration was looking for somebody who was sharp theologically, but was, I hesitate to use the word moderate, maybe moderated. maybe he was much more winsome in his presentation. So I think you might get that sense. It doesn't mean that he can't be feisty. There are certainly places in the Gangrena where he is. But the other thing to add here is that Maastricht's sources, as far as who he's influenced by, it includes someone like William Ames. The relationship of how he structures theology, how he thinks about it. Johannes Hornbeek is certainly a source, but Hornbeek and Fuchsius at Utrecht are an important point there.
So one thing that people are going to notice when they open this book and start to learn a bit about Maastricht's approach, you'll notice the form, but one thing is this four-part approach that he has to theology. Can you describe that for us and speak about how this might be unique to him, or how this helps him to achieve the desired ends he has within his theologizing?
I think one thing to remember is he's, on one level, he's not the only one to do this. His method of you do exegesis in order to lead to doctrine, in order to do an elenctic defense, and then to move to practice, that process is in one sense not new. If you read Turretin in his preface, one of the things Turretin laments is that he's not, in order to beat his students to printing his stuff, he has to get this.
Sorry, we're getting a loop here. Sorry, it seems like it's done. That happened earlier today. I don't know what's causing that, but anyway, okay. You were saying in order to beat his students.
Yeah, Turretin was if you read the preface closely, he was concerned that the students were going to beat him to press with his own material. So one of the things
they're pirates, they're literary pirates, bootleggers. This confirms my theory. No, this confirms my theory here that theological students, particularly MDiv students, are the feistiest and most precocious of all students anywhere.
If you go to most universities and institutions that have a floor of theology, that's the one that generally has the most detective sort of instrument to prevent theft of books. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
But also, at least with Turretin, what you'll find is Turretin laments that he's not able to give a fuller account of his theology, and so he gives you the elenctic section. But that doesn't mean he's not doing the exegesis as well. Throughout this period, all of these professors are known as doctors of Holy Scripture. So that's an important aspect to understand. You have some theologians at Leiden and elsewhere. For example, at Leiden, it wasn't uncommon for a professor to lecture on one book of Scripture for 4 or 5 years. So if you had that professor for class,
that's all you learned.
You were getting that, you were seeing his theological method every day in the exegesis, but he's using that book as a way in which to spiral out to other doctrines, so that you would get the whole breadth of theology, but you would get it through this particular aperture. And so in that sense, Maastricht's not doing something new. What is new, perhaps, is the fact that he's giving it all to you at once. Maastricht's commentaries are mixed into this book. His commentaries on Scripture. This is what the exegesis means. Whereas you might have other folks that would divide it out and say the commentaries are over here and this particular handbook is over here.
Mm-hmm. What was Maastricht's influence at the time? Was he well known to his contemporaries? Was he seen as kind of a theological leader of sorts? Or was he, just another professor at one of these institutions? How are we to understand that? And then has that changed over the centuries?
I would say that his primary work was, at least this publication, for example, to put it in perspective, the major edition here that we're working on is what's perhaps known as the second edition. The first edition was much smaller and much more abridged. So the second edition is kind of the magnum opus, and it comes out in 1698, 99. Maastricht dies in 1706. So there's a sense in which the influence of this work is after Maastricht, and yet on another level, Maastricht was not. He was single. He never married, and upon his death, he donated his estate or a large portion of it to seminary students. But by the time you get to 1720, 1725, the seminary students at Utrecht didn't know who he was.
Really?
So you've got someone here who has a major treatment. They're thoroughly engaged in the issues of the day. Their work circulated in a variety of forms. The gangrena was well known in his lifetime. There were some Jesuits who actually commend it as a way to deal with Cartesianism. So which work?
We're good. I don't know. I need to isolate and find out what's causing that issue, but we'll just have to persist. It's good now. I apologize. I don't know what it is, if it's Zoom or something, or anyway.
So all I have to say is that his work would have been known in some quarters. Mm-hmm. Among the Reformed in the Netherlands, he was known. He was a preacher, and he served in a variety of contexts in some of the Dutch Reformed churches. So he would have been known in his own context. By the time you get to the mid-1730s and 50s, his work is being received in the American colonies. That's that famous remark of Jonathan Edwards to a colleague of his, second to the Bible, get this book.
Yes, the blurb of all blurbs, right?
Yes, right.
Or endorsement of all endorsements.
That's right.
Wow.
But I think when Jonathan Edwards endorses it in that way, I think the scholarship still needs to be done, looking very finely and closely at Edwards' work and looking at Maastricht's work to determine how much influence is there and what kind of influence, content, method, certain rallying and arrangement of authorities. That sort of work still needs to be done. But I think one of the things you can say is that Edwards deeply appreciated Maastricht's method. His emphasis on saving faith, that chapter in volume 2 dealing with saving faith was actually out of a previous work where Maastricht was encouraging elders to become better at in engaging their congregants towards saving faith, and more particularly encouraging them even towards what you might call particular persuasion. That is, that they would come to a closer understanding of saving faith, such that they could with confidence say that Jesus Christ is my Savior. That work was motivated by Maastricht seeing a need in the churches, especially among elders, in the way that they were handling congregants. On one hand, he wanted to guard against presumption. And on the other hand, he didn't want to inhibit people from coming to a vibrant persuasion, a humble, faithful persuasion of God's promises for them. So that aspect of Maastricht's usage on saving faith, I think, is so helpful, especially when we consider the need. Maastricht says very clearly, in order to do theology rightly and to receive it rightly, you have to be moving in saving faith. Hornbeck, his predecessor and mentor, doesn't exactly put it the same way, but Hornbeck's preface would say that you needed to press forward into the kingdom. So even though he doesn't have a locus on saving faith at the beginning, right next to the Prolegomena, Hornbeck is asking the same things, whether or not you're pressing into the kingdom of God properly and with intent to believe.
It's tremendous to think about. Then you get this picture that all of his theological output is driven by and done within the context of the church. So it's church-centered. There's an ecclesiastical or ecclesiological, perhaps a better term, focus to what he's doing. And that, I mean, that's tremendously encouraging. You can see why a group like Reformation Heritage Books is very interested in publishing this series, because it fits very well with their particular emphases and concerns. And you can see also why a figure like Jonathan Edwards would be so interested and would admire Maastricht so much. It's a good model for us to learn. We often forget this and don't practice our theology this way. Early on in Volume 1, the Prolegomena book, it includes a few things. I'd like to talk a bit about preaching there, but you also see the theological method described. And what is unique to Maastricht? Or at least I should say, what can we learn as contemporary theologians from Maastricht in terms of his addressing and the way he approaches theological methodology?
Well, I think he's coming from a period where it's understood that you can move from biblical studies into doctrine you're not jumping a ditch. You're not jumping a ditch of history. You're not. He doesn't see that. He sees that it was given specifically for that purpose of moving people towards saving faith in Christ, and so that does shape the way you view both the tasks of exegesis as well as the tasks of doctrinal formulation. Maastricht's also deeply engaged in the exegetical arguments of others. He's not doing exegesis in isolation. If you look at his work, for example, in the first volume, talking about the nature of theology, you'll find that he's dealing with some Jesuits that we perhaps have never heard of. But they are Jesuits that were deeply engaged on exegetical questions. And Maastricht sees them as worthy of engagement, even though they lived before him within 100 years. So I guess what I would say is you see in him not only an exegetical and pastoral method in that direction, but it's also highly academic. You'll find places that, I'll tell you, as a translator, it's not just wrestling with what he's doing with the Latin. He even has a comment where he'll say, right, okay, Beza has this in his treatment of this particular verse in Matthew. The Ethiopic text has this. And you go, right. Let me go see if I can track down a version of the Ethiopic text. Oh, wait, here's a 19th century German commentary.
Right.
Yay.
And this is one of those things where it's like a footnote in the book that we have, and that was a week of work for you.
Yeah. Yes, there's things like that in there where you're trying to, those footnotes are a labor of love.
It's important. It's part of the being a scholar and documenting.
Well, I think that's an important point for us as well. So you have the text before you, but you also need to have a realization that Maastricht is engaging his confessional context as well as a philosophical one. He's still making the distinctions. Lutherans say this, the Roman Catholics, or as he would refer to them, the Papists, say this. But his most critical pejoratives are actually what he would call the Socinianizing remonstrance, or the Cartesianizing something along these lines, the Cartesianizing reformed. So that usage of these progressive participles gives you a vibrant understanding that he views these as ongoing present-day issues in his time.
Wow. Well, Volume 1 not only includes that, an introduction to his theological method, but it includes a homiletical aid. So when we're looking at this copy here, people can order that, and it's available right now. Check that out at Westminster Books or RHB, wherever you can find books. You get your copy. A little while ago, they were running a deal, and I hope maybe when Volume 3 comes out, they'll probably spark that deal up again. But it includes a homiletical aid, in which describes, his approach to preaching. What were his particular views here, and how is this helpful for us?
So what you're referring to is what he calls the best method of preaching.
Yeah,
and
there we go.
He very, very quickly reminds the reader that it's the best one, not because it's his. That's not why he does it. What you notice if you look through the preface in that work, and this bit on the best method of preaching is he's laying out the fact that he sees in his day practical approaches to people in the pew are declining. You can get a very fine exegetical sermon, but it has nothing. It doesn't change the way that the person in the pew is living, and doesn't strike them in such a way that they would remember it. And the result is, he would say that pastors are stultifying their hearers spiritually. So what you see there, and this is an interesting point. He never knew quite where to put this best method of preaching. In his first edition of the Theoretical Practical Theology, this admonition on preaching was put before the Prolegomena. In the second edition, it was put at the very end of the work. So it's almost like do you put it as the first thing that would-be pastors need to hear? We're aiming at preaching.
Right.
Does it need to be the last thing a seminary graduate hears as well? And all that you've learned, remember, you have to preach.
Uh-huh.
So in the selection of where do we put this in these volumes, we chose to put this aspect of the best method of preaching there.
Interesting.
It is a homiletical aid. He will also be the first to tell you that these aspects, exegesis, doctrine, polemics, and practice, you may not use all of those in your sermon at the same time. He doesn't. It would be easy to caricature Maastricht and say, "Oh, this is the 4-part way you do it, and every sermon has to roll out this way." I think he would say it depends on the text you're working with, and you need to understand your hearers, and you need to be careful about how deeply you go into polemical issues. He has a line in this best method of preaching at one point where he says, "If there's don't exhume the corpse of controversy." If there's a controversy that's dead and gone, in trying to explain the controversy, you might win some converts.
Right.
So there's a
why
sense
bother?
In which,
yeah,
you're right.
It'd be counterintuitive.
There's a sense in which you have to do this sort of method, and you have to be very, very aware of your congregation. What is going to be most useful to them, and what's going to be the most clear to them. So he's just trying to practically admonish pastors, work through your exegesis well, but please remember, if you don't ever actually get around to applying it to your congregants in a way that's going to drive them to faith,
right,
or build them in some aspect of Christian character, you're killing them.
This reminds me of a few things. We have with the Puritans, they're very specific form of preaching, this Puritan plain form, or they have a structure that is exemplified or demonstrated quite frequently in Jonathan Edwards' sermons, and you see how that works out. And I wish Jeff could have been here today. He was ill. He was planning to be with us, and he no doubt would be able to speak to this better. But you definitely see the same kind of form. It reminds me also of something else that Dr. Gaffin mentioned at one point. We often speak about a redemptive historical hermeneutic, and then sometimes people will speak about redemptive historical preaching. But that sometimes can be a conflation of issues, because the redemptive historical hermeneutic is just that. It's a hermeneutic. There might be different homiletic forms that could convey the lessons that we learn from studying the scriptures in a redemptive historical manner, which I'm convinced is an appropriate way to do it, because that's what the Bible teaches us to do. But that's another point. So how would you see Maastricht here in terms of his method? It's a homiletical aid, but is he more along those lines where he sees that this is a good theological method, but depending on the text and the people, the form of the sermon may need to be different sermon by sermon? It's not like to bring in another illustration, like a Procrustean bed for sermons.
Correct. I mean, one thing that Maastricht, I think he's hinting at one point, is a pastor should be so consistent at some level in his method that as people listen to him over time, they can see what he's doing.
I see.
Working with the text, he's talking about a doctrine, and he's moving to practice. And why is that helpful? Because it's also teaching congregants how to hear your sermons. You're not you're not inventing a structure, or
Right.
if you will,
Yeah,
or
like a postmodern novel. I
Right.
just read a book by George Saunders, which is talking about these ghosts in a in a cemetery. Like Abraham Lincoln's a figure in there. Lincoln comes in to meet with his dead son, his ghost, and it's like you have to read half the book to even figure out what's going on, because it's the whole form of it is so new. You don't even know what you have in your hand.
Right.
So we don't want to be doing that every Sunday.
Exactly. And so I think that's one point to make with Maastricht, is that he's trying to, on one level, he's trying to get people into a framework where they actually remember the sermon.
Yeah.
How are they going to practice it the rest of their life if they don't remember it?
Yeah.
He's thinking through those sorts of issues. We need to help people understand how to read the scriptures, but we also need to help them understand that doctrine is for life. Doctrine is not esoteric. It's not abstract. It actually, he labors that every head of doctrine that you run into in a systematic theology has some aspect of application. I wish some theologians worried about that more.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, seriously. This is focusing more heavily on the idea of corporate worship and the ministry of the word as a means of grace, but I'm curious to see how that same idea, that emphasis on both, that this doctrine is for life, what this might look like in the classroom. So as an historian, perhaps maybe I'm wondering if you could transport us to the classroom, and if we were to walk in as students, and what would we expect on a given day from Maastricht? What would he do in order to teach his students? Because I think this is helpful to know, at least because people, maybe by now kind of become a little bit familiar with the scholastic method, but even there, this idea of the disputation and stuff like that, people, I think a lot of our listeners are not even aware of that. What does a classroom even look like?
So what's going on is that as a professor, typically you would have, going all the way back to the medievals, whether you're studying medicine or law or theology, you would have some text. That's what a lectio is. It's a reading. It has to do with some sort of, it's the lecture that you're engaged in has some sort of commentary on a text that's going to deal with a particular issue. So they're working through this text, and then they're raising different issues as they go. Now, Maastricht would do this in the typical way of raising theses. You would have theses that would be, these are the main points, the main ideas behind this doctrine or this issue, and then you would go through and like any good state of the question, who says what and why, and what does that mean? So as you go through and give those defenses of the theses, by the time you get to the end of the classroom, you would have probably anywhere from 5 to 25 theses that have been worked through in the time frame. Later in the student's education was when they would come back and have to defend it. So they would have to actually come through and say, here's what the proper doctrine is. As a class exercise, there would also be folks, sometimes professors, sometimes students, that would actually kind of play the other argument. They'd raise other questions to see how the student does it, and the professor would be there to preside over the disputation and would wade in. In fact, that generates some comments from other theologians and professors. Yeah. This professor wades in too much. The student has totally botched it. Get out of the way. I need to salvage this particular point. And so this process of moving from lecture and reading and theses into disputation, and then understanding that the publications that are coming out of that process is what you have before you. So sometimes I think moderns pick up these old 17th and 18th century dogmatic theologies or these syntagmas and other collections, and it's a genre confusion.
I see. Sure.
You've just stepped into a doctoral seminar. You've just stepped into a master's seminar, and you're working through a state of the question. That's what you've got here. The translation process is, now how are you going to preach this?
Yeah.
And so what you see in Maastricht in this is exactly that. It is an academic work.
Mm-hmm.
It's got I would say, a pastoral goal, an a goal for the service of the church, but it's given in an academic form.
That's helpful. I think readers are going to need to know that as they're approaching this. And we have here Volume 1, Prolegomena, but then Volume 2, Faith in the Triune God. What can we look forward to with the remaining, I suppose, 5 volumes?
Right. Well, in Volume 3, we'll get into the basically the covenant of works and the fall, and then we move into the covenant of grace. I will tell you that the chapter that he deals with the covenant of grace from the resurrection of Christ to the end of the world is perhaps one of the longest chapters that I've ever encountered, because I estimate that chapter is going to be 156,000 words.
The chapter. Wow. That's a lot.
Yes. So if you want to see Maastricht's church history, that's that chapter, the covenant of grace from the resurrection of Christ to the end of the world, and he's charting, here's what's going on.
Sure.
So they're wrapped into this work dealing with the doctrines is actually here's his understanding of history. Now, he wasn't the only one who ever did that. For example, John Owen's work that was translated, I guess, about probably 15 to 20 years ago now. If you look at that one, that's also has a historical bent to it. So Maastricht's not the only one to do this sort of thing. How do we understand the covenant of grace in history? And then from there, we move into what you might call the more of the questions around moral theology.
I see.
What is sometimes called ascetic theology. Here's the virtues, here's the vices, here's the practices specifically. Here's how we should behave towards ourselves, towards God, towards our neighbor. Those are the sorts of things that are coming out in the last volume.
Yeah.
So volumes 3, 4, 5, and 6 get us through here's Christ, the work of Christ, and then after that, that long chapter that I was talking about on the covenant of grace and history.
Wow.
So a lot coming down the way. The section I'll tell you, the section that he's dealing with on the nature of on Christ and dealing with what it means for Christ to be a redeemer, it's wonderful. One reason, not only because of what we mentioned about practice, but Maastricht really is a gazetteer of what's going on in Reformed thought. What you begin to see is Maastricht says some Reforms say this, some Reforms say that. Here's where I think a safer path is. Sometimes he just makes the distinction and doesn't comment any further. He just says there's these differences. So what you do get out of Maastricht is he kind of gives you the theological topography of what's going on in roughly 1700 as he sees it, and from the perspective of the Dutch Reformed Church. He's deeply engaged. He does read things that are coming across in English and German and French and other things. So he's got his finger on a lot of different issues that are percolating in his day. So there's a lot here for, I think, pastors, and there's a lot here for those who are interested in this sort of pastoral theology and doctrinal theology. But there's also quite a bit here for scholars. So this text, I hope, will serve in a variety of ways as we consider.
Yeah, it does seem like that. He seems to be a convenient figure to study, not just to learn what the content is, but given that he's got his fingers in a lot of other contemporary issues, there would seem to be something for a variety of different disciplines. The systematicians, the practical theologians, as we understand them. I mean, everyone ought to be a practical theologian, but you know what I mean. The homileticians, also the philosophers, the historians. I mean, this is a significant work. No, I encourage you. Thanks for working on it. And maybe it's a dangerous or trepidatious thing for me to ask, but what might we say would be the horizon upon which these books might come out? Is there a estimated
Lord willing.
Time zone.
Lord willing, we would like to have a volume out one a year.
Okay. Wow.
That's so we're hopeful that we'll have volume 3.
Yeah.
That's
it's just as thick.
size.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. and it's just, like I said, when you have it, to put it in perspective, this is about 200 to 250,000 words.
Uh-huh.
So when you're talking about a chapter that's 156, you're talking about something that's this big.
It's amazing. And also, just for comparison, even just typesetting that book could take months. It's not an insignificant undertaking. It's not merely just translating, and you got to edit, but then you got to typeset, and you got to proof. And it even though the book has been written, it hasn't been translated. There's enormous amounts of effort here from many, many different people to make this happen. And we often just presume it's like, I'm going to pay my $30, and it just shows up. Well,
you're making a tremendous point, and I can't say it enough. The work of a publishing house is tremendous. The staff at RHB are doing an outstanding job, and it's been a pleasure to work with them. It's also been a pleasure to work with a lot of different scholars and pastors and people in this process. I can't think of any one person working on this task that doesn't have their fingers in other tasks. Mm-hmm. So it is a project that has gone forward because of that. Mm-hmm. And then the other point I would say is, translation societies live to put works like this out, but they need that support of the communities.
Yeah.
If you enjoy these sorts of works, the Dutch Reformed Translation Society would love to hear from you.
Yeah, right. No, it's encouraging. They need to be funded too and supported. These things just don't happen for free. You need financial support to make because it's
and it's also that work of encouragement.
Yeah,
that's an aspect of it too.
Sure.
Translation work for all the people involved, translators, editors, everyone. It's a lot of time in front of a computer screen. Mm-hmm. And there's a very real possibility you will not know everyone that the work goes out to or influences. Mm-hmm. So it's a gift by this whole process from the Dutch Reformed Translation Society on down. Mm-hmm. So we're grateful and happy to do it, but it is a group project.
So I guess the moral of the story, the call to action of this podcast is go ye forth and thank your local translator. But seriously, people, we take it for granted, and we should thank the Lord, but also as we have opportunity for folks like you and everyone on your team, and folks like Dr. Gaffin and on his team that translated Voss, for example. These are just illustrations. And we love those works. We benefit from those works, but we don't remember often the names of the people that were involved. And maybe we need to spend more time on that and be thankful for the work that they've done. But we do appreciate the humble service of the translator, because it is often you end up being an unsung hero.
It's working through with a bunch of other people to do it. It's a humbling task all the way around. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's a joy as well.
Yeah.
I personally, it's an enriching experience to go through and trace out who he's working with and citing and those things. And I'll have to say, because of Maastricht, the limits of my curiosity have grown quite a bit.
Okay, how many dissertation topics or monograph topics do you think you've spawned in the course of your translation? You must think, this would be interesting to examine, and it must have a whole pile of ideas just waiting for you to write.
You know what's most fun about it, actually, is whenever you've worked through something like this and then you're working with seminary students.
Yeah, you can pass it on to them.
Or others. Well, and because there's more than enough work to be done.
Oh, of course.
And two, the nature of this sort of scholarship takes the conversation. Mm. I don't want to hang out with Lone Ranger.
Sorry.
I said I don't want to hang out with Lone Ranger scholars. I'm much more interested in finding people who are engaging in these sorts of topics and that sort of thing. And what's encouraging to me is whenever I deal with students who have a particular issue or an interest in something and they're willing to explore it and to develop the skills necessary to do it. The same goes for when I meet, I would say, colleagues in the field and pastors as well, who are interested in studying these particular topics or going deeper in something. That's just like icing on the cake. It's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I can do is encourage people to go pick up a copy of both volumes, to wait for the volumes coming ahead and grab copies of them as well. But Todd, thanks so much for taking the time today. It's been a pleasure to meet you and to speak with you for a little over an hour. And many blessings and encouragement upon your labors at Westminster. We look forward to hearing from you in the future.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, you got it. Well, I encourage people to visit Westminster online. You can do that at wts.edu. Of course, you can head on over to the Westminster Bookstore. You can head on over to Reformation Heritage, and they're always putting out excellent books, almost too many for me to keep up with. We got some others lined up with interviews coming out in the future. Book by Alan Strange and the imputation of Christ's act of obedience to the Westminster Standards. And they've got a Puritan movie on the horizon, all sorts of interesting things. So thanks to them and to the folks over there who labor in this way for our benefit. Of course, Reformed Forum is online as well at reformedforum.org. If you head on over to the website, you'll be able to find out information about all of our programs and forthcoming events and some of our publications as well. So I encourage you to do that, and thanks so much for listening. We hope you join us again next time on Christ the Center.